Hello again, friends. Once more, let's hit some in other news. And I'm really excited today because the in other news story that I'm going to give to you is really epic. It's epic because it's extremely geographic. We're going to talk about lots of different regions of the planet in this one story. But it's also kind of futuristic in terms of it will help you understand what's going on planet Earth a lot more just by talking about this one thing that's not going to be covered that much in the U.S. press. What am I speaking of? It's got me in a geographic tizzy. Southeast Asia is where we're going to head to. And we're heading there because it's pretty active right this second. They just had a big ASEAN meeting a few weeks back. And right now the Thais are hosting the World Economic Forum. And that's exciting. But what's even more exciting than the forum itself is that Aung San Suu Kyi, our heroine, pro-democracy, most awesome lady ever, from Burma, for the first time in 20 years, because she spent most of her life under house arrest there, has left Burma to speak at this World Economic Forum. So there's all sorts of international press attention and activity and things going on in Southeast Asia. That's awesome. I ain't talking about any of that. Another dude that's there right now is this guy, what's his name? U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta is in Singapore. This is what's got me hot and bothered because he made a speech earlier today, and by today I mean June 2nd, 2012, in which he outlined a future of the U.S. Armed Forces that's got me fired up, pun intended. You know, firing weapons. Okay, what am I talking about? Leon Panetta made a speech in which he said, by the way, we in America are going to be recalibrating all our armed forces, specifically the Navy right this second, to have a greater Asian presence, a greater Pacific presence, because that's where the action is in the 21st century, and the U.S. wants to go ahead and strategically shift people there, ships there, planes there, to be better equipped and to have our influence in the Pacific region in this crucial era of humanity where the action is now centered there. Yeah! Thank you, Leon! Who's been telling you for years that this shift has been underway, that the U.S. was going to start pulling troops and permanent bases from all over the world and start refocusing them in the Pacific? That would be this guy's been saying that. So, to me, it's great to hear Leon Panetta, U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, actually just go ahead and be outright and openly talking about this now. And the numbers he gave that you should know is he said something to the effect of, we're going to go from a 50-50 situation to a 60-40 situation, Pacific heavy. All right, what do those ratios mean? Well, specifically just thinking about the Navy, we have about 285 naval vessels in the U.S. Navy. And hundreds of thousands of troops scattered throughout the world, too, in different bases. And what Panetta is suggesting is, right now, we have about 50% of those ships and people in the Atlantic, and about 50% of those in the Pacific. Why would we pick oceans? Because we're a continent in a country that has two different oceans that we have to either defend or be offensive in. So the two spheres, the sides, the bookends, the ocean bookends of America, that's what we have to defend. That's kind of the, the expansion of our influence and defensive and offensive postures. So classically, it's been 50-50 here for a while. By the way, 200 years ago, it was all in the Atlantic. We're living in a world, that's why I love this story, because it's really reflecting bigger changes happening on the planet and regional changes. You know all about the regions. So, 500 years ago, the world was European-centered. Europe were all the major powers. They controlled all the rest of the planet. Everything moved in and around and to Europe. Then Europe started to go away, and, the last 100 years has kind of been the American century, certainly since World War II, where America's been the center. But think about your geography. Europe was the center forever, then America was the center of planetary activity. In both circumstances, the Atlantic plays heavily into that. For shipping, for military, for everything. It was an Atlantic-centered world for a very long time. For anybody who's taken my class or knows my stuff, you know that I've been talking about this Pacific shift that's going on. And we're there. I mean, to me, the shift is done. The Atlantic Ocean is no longer the super highway of trade and military and everything else, it's just not that important anymore. And think about current events. Europe is crashing and burning right now. America's in a recession, probably going to get worse. And who's doing well? Oh, those Asian economies. So what we've seen in the last, specifically, 50 years is a move from an Atlantic-centered world to a Pacific-centered world. And I believe Leon Panetta and everyone else on planet Earth who pays attention to these things is predicting this correctly and is going to react in a way that starts to focus more on the Pacific. The United States understands that the future of not just trade, not just politics, but also military and offensive capabilities are going to be heavily centered on the Pacific. So he's saying we used to be 50-50. Half our ships over in the Atlantic, half our ships over in the Pacific. What the hell are those people in Atlantic going to be defending? Let's make it 60-40. 60% of U.S. forces are now going to be focused on the Pacific, 40 over in the Atlantic. I actually think, and he's saying this is going to happen by 2020, I actually think it's going to be more like 70 or 70-30 or 80-20 at some point, because really, what are we worried about in the Atlantic? That the German Empire is going to rise again? There's no real threats over in the Atlantic. Much more activity going on in the Pacific. And by much more activity, I mean there's going to be hundreds of thousands of more transports of ships carrying goods and services all across the Pacific. The Pacific is now the superhighway of activity. And so you're going to want your military there to be able to influence and control the area, to protect shipping, to protect your economic interests, but also to counter the expansion of, let's just be honest, China's Navy, which China's investing billions in. So I don't want to suggest that, this is going to be a U.S.-China standoff. It kind of is. But we all realize that China is growing very fast, that China is investing billions in their military overall, but they are specifically focusing in on their Navy. And why would that be? Because they also understand that the Pacific is the superhighway of trade for the 21st century, if not for the next millennium. So everybody's interested in having, their influence and forces active in the Pacific. The U.S. wants to counter Chinese growth and Chinese influence, and the Chinese, of course, want to counter everybody else. Of course, this has already come to a head in the South China Sea. I shouldn't say it's come to a head. It's building up. That all-crucial area that's south of China, thus the term South China Sea, that no less than 5 or 6 different sovereign states claim ownership of, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, Brunei. I think Malaysia makes a claim, and China claims it all. This is a story we've talked about in other newses, and the Plaid Avenger has actually raged about it. So this is a hot topic of our time, and yes, that probably figures into Leon Panetta's military shift as well. He actually outright in the speech said, no. We're not facing off against the Chinese, and we're not trying to put a bunch more forces over here in order to repress the Chinese. But he did actually make reference to the South China Sea issue and said, hey, that needs to be dealt with by the international community, and everybody involved should be following international law on this, which of course is going to piss off the Chinese because they're just claiming everything. They're saying it's all ours. Okay, given that shift is occurring now, and it's pretty big. That's a pretty big shift. I know you're thinking 50-50 to 60-40. That's not, it's big. It's big. Because you're looking at, let's see, the U.S. Navy has about 285 ships, 11 aircraft carriers. And what we're saying is, okay, now the majority of those 285, and by ships we mean everything from, frigates to fighter aircraft support ships to aircraft carriers to cruisers to destroyers to combat ships to submarines. So we're not just talking some boats floating around here. We're talking serious military offensive and defensive capabilities that now 60, probably to 70% of them are going to be floating in and around the Pacific. How else does this affect geography and the global balance of power, but also relationships between countries? Well, where is the United States going to put all these people? Yes, navies can float around on the water, but they got to port up and dock eventually. And if you start thinking strategically, where would the U.S. be putting its future bases, its future ports, its future points where it can refuel, restock its ships in friendly territory with countries that are going to support the U.S. presence there? This is where we get into some very easy future predictions that we will live to see come true. I guarantee it, because I've already seen some of this stuff. The United States, of course, if you followed any of these podcasts, is already now increasing a military presence in Australia, a place that's never had permanent U.S. bases. The U.S. bases in northern Australia originally were going to have like 20 or 30 soldiers in them, and everybody downplayed it. This is just a year or two ago. Actually, just a year ago. The U.S. said, yeah, we're going to have a military base in northern Australia. No big deal, like 20 people. It's no big deal. That's now up to 200 in 1 year. I mean, these things are moving fast. And I have a very good friend, usually in the office here, who has a relative in the Marines, and that relative is getting restationed in New Zealand. That one hasn't even been reported to anybody. It's all in the kind of preparedness stages. So the U.S. has not even admitted that they're starting a base in New Zealand, but we happen to know through insider info that yes, there are folks over there setting things up and training troops for a port or a facility that's going to be New Zealand. Okay, Australia and New Zealand are now in this game with us, and we're talking, they've always been allies, but we're talking actual troop presence. Okay, that's a big difference. Who else might be in this game? And now we're starting to predict a few things here. Obviously, the U.S. bases in, say, Hawaii and Guam, they're going to be getting buku bucks coming up too, because they're going to want to revamp and reestablish those to be able to support, 60% of the Pacific Fleet from what's now 50%. So all of the U.S. territories where there are naval facilities and, Army bases, they're going to get more money and be upped. We already talked in another podcast about how Japan is going to maybe get rid of the Okinawa base. Maybe it's going to get moved to the other side of the island. Maybe they're going to get moved to other places in Japan. But there's no way that they're going to just cut loose the 50,000 U.S. troops that are in Japan. And there's no way that we're going to relinquish control, or I shouldn't say control, but we will maintain the port facilities we have in Japan. There's no doubt about that. I'm actually more interested in, back to the South China Sea, who are the future players in this that aren't players right now? Ha! You should jot this down in your brain. The Philippines. The United States has been an ally of the Philippines since we took the damn place over. What was that, 1898 in the U.S.-Spanish War, when we took it from the Spanish Empire. And there have been, since World War II, or during and after World War II, there were U.S. bases across the Philippines. It's a staunch U.S. ally. And the Filipinos are kind of classically known as naval peoples. They have a serious navy, and there's always been Filipinos supporting the U.S. Navy everywhere in the world. If you actually go to like Norfolk, Virginia, where there's huge, the Atlantic fleet is kind of centered there in Norfolk. Huge Filipino population. I don't know why that is. I guess it's physical geography, but Filipinos have always been kind of naval peoples and supported U.S. Navy. But I think it was 10 years ago the last U.S. base closed in the Philippines. I don't know that the Filipino government wanted them to leave or pushed them out. It's just one of those things that everybody said, well, there's no necessity to have these ports here. There's no necessity to have a U.S. presence here, so I guess we're going to leave. And all the U.S. bases in the Philippines closed. Watch that to change fast. Because the Philippines specifically are the ones who are the most pissed off at the Chinese right now over that South China Sea territorial fight. In fact, there's a place called the Scarborough Shoal. You can go check that out. The Philippines are saying, this is ours. It's right off our coast. Come on, get out of here, China. You can't claim something like 10 miles off our coast. And China's saying, yes, we can. And there's already boats bumping into each other on the Chinese and Filipino side. So that is a hot button issue, and I think that's going to play directly into the Philippines saying, by the way, the United States, can you actually reestablish a gigantic naval port here and have an aircraft carrier or two? Come on in, we'll port you up. That would be in their best strategic interest and the United States' strategic interest for what they've now stated, that they want a bigger presence in the Pacific, specifically there in that South China Sea territory. So watch for U.S.-Filipino ties to strengthen. They've already been strong, but watch for increased military activity. It has not happened yet, but I'll bet you're going to see it. And I'm going to end with another place that you would never imagine. And I've said this a couple times, and I want to say it again. Vietnam. It's crazy. Vietnam, a country that the U.S. tried to bomb into oblivion 30 years ago. And we killed millions of their citizens in a horrific campaign. They actually don't harbor much of a grudge against us, if at all. Vietnam is one of the most fantastic places on planet Earth, and I'm speaking physical geography, it's beautiful, but the people are just awesome. They don't harbor that much of a grudge against the United States and its people. They just don't. And it looks like Vietnamese and U.S. interests are aligning economically and militarily, because the Vietnamese have a booming economy right now, much smaller than, say, China's, but it's vibrant and it's happening. And the U.S. and Vietnam have been establishing strong trade ties just in the last few years. The Vietnamese actually have a stake in the South China Sea that they claimed part of the South China Sea, and the Chinese say, nope, it's ours. And Vietnamese and Chinese ships have been bumping into each other. In fact, look for a flashpoint in the South China Sea to actually be between China and Vietnam. Vietnam don't want to take no crap, and they've been sending out boats, and so has China. So it would be in the strategic interest of the Vietnamese, actually, to say, hey, U.S., why don't you start a naval port here, too? Wow. I mean, I love paying attention to the planet, because when that happens, and it's going to happen, I'm just convinced, everyone in America will be shocked and say, oh my gosh, we're going to have a U.S. military base was invited to be started in Vietnam, and everybody will be shocked except me and you. For those of us that follow this, it's like, no, of course, of course. One of the mistakes the U.S. made even getting involved in the Vietnam War was the U.S. was convinced that Vietnam was a puppet and ally of China. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was not true 30 years ago. It wasn't true 300 years before that. The Vietnamese and the Chinese, I won't say have been bitter enemies, but they certainly have been competing for resources. They've never been big buddies. And I think Vietnam, much like the Philippines and other entities in the South China Sea area, are going to look at this and say, hey, we can't take on China by ourselves. And why would we? Let's just invite the United States here to start an Army base, a Marines base, a naval base. We'll let them port up their aircraft carriers. Yeah, come on in, because that then sends a message to China and everyone else in the Pacific that, hey, we're kind of on the U.S. side here. We're supporting these guys because they're going to support our interest in our claim to the South China Sea, or at least our claim for more stable relations in the Pacific, where we, and that's everybody except China, don't want China to dominate. Does that make sense? China's not going to get isolated here, but all the other players here don't want to see a China that's out of control, that has a gigantic navy that can just wipe everybody off the face of the Pacific Ocean if they wanted to. Nobody wants that except China. Everybody else is going to say, hey, let's support the United States to balance the power. Blammo! That's all I got for now. Big things happening right now. And Leon Panetta is openly talking about them. And I think it's exciting if you want to understand the world, the evolution of the Pacific, the evolution of the regions of the area, and U.S. foreign policy. Any military folks out there that know something I don't know about what's happening in the Pacific, please cue it in right here and give me a comment or two or email me so I can get even smarter still. But for now, party on.